alaikum all, and let's all start the section of biochemistry after you finish the molecular biology part of this course. We're going to start with an introduction to biochemistry in this lecture, and we'll start first with defining what is the science of biochemistry. It's actually the science that is concerned with studying molecules in a biological system, whether this is a plant, animal, a human being, or whatever kind of biological system. Biochemistry studies these molecules and their relationship between these molecules, in addition to the interactions that happen all the time between the different types of molecules. So why would you take a course, a complete course, or even more than one course in biochemistry? If you understand biochemistry, you're going to understand the biological system, the life system of an organism. And we're going to focus on a human being since we are teaching medical students. So if you understand biochemistry, you're going to have a complete understanding of the molecules and their interactions. You're in normal condition as well as in disease condition. If you understand what happens to molecules in your body as a whole in a certain medical condition or in a certain disease, you know how to deal with this disease, how to treat it. So if you get first a diagnosis, you know what's the change, so you move on to the next stage of treatment. For example, a very simple example, patient with diabetes type 1, and in this type of diabetes there is low insulin level, for example. So if you know that the insulin is low, this molecule is low, so you just replace it, as simple as that. If you know the structure of this molecule, you can synthesize it in the factory. And so understanding the chemical part of these biological molecules can help you treat your patients, diagnose your patients, monitor diseases. I mean checking the progress of the disease, whether it's declining or whether you're going to a cure, for example. It also the science helps you to design drugs, and this is what happens in the by pharmacists who are actually working on research, not just selling selling medicines. So designing drugs on a computational level involves understanding and studying the molecules and the chemistry of these molecules and their interactions with each other, and then synthesizing them by biochemical reactions or chemical reactions, and then testing them as drugs before they can be used in the clinics for your patients. So there are different disciplines that you would benefit from studying biochemistry in the practice of medicine. In our living systems or living creatures, there are several elements of the periodic table, and we're mainly composed of 31 elements as shown in the periodic table. Some of these elements are very abundant, and the primary ones are actually carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and they constitute more than 96% of an organism's weight. There are some other elements that we need to a lesser degree, but they're still important, like sulfur and phosphorus, and even the ones that we need in a very trace amounts or very small amounts, and these are mostly elements, they're still very important to the structure and maintenance of health and well-being of an organism. Let's make a quick revision of covalent bonds, since we're talking about organic molecules and we're talking about living systems, and you already have taken a full course of organic chemistry, but we're going to have a very quick revision of some important points to remember for this course. The first one regarding the covalent bonds generally. And these are the main bonds in the covalent molecules, and they have different properties that you should keep in mind while studying this course, such as bond strength, and this is related to the amount of energy you need to break a bond. Okay, so and this type of bonds, or the covalent bonds, are relatively strong ones, and they need large amount of energy to be broken. Another property is the bond length, and this is related to bond strength. Bond length is actually the distance between the nuclei of the two atoms making a bond, and this distance is different depending on the size of the atoms that, or the nuclei, size of the nuclei of the atoms contributing to the bond, depending also on the type of bond, whether it's a single bond, double bond, triple bond, and it also contributes, as I said, to the bond strength. The longer the bond, the further the distance, so this means that the bond is less strong. But if the distance is less, this means the bond length is less and the bond strength is higher or larger. Another property to keep in mind is the bond orientation, and this means the overall geometry and 3D shape and orientation of the atoms in a molecule that determine the overall shape or 3D shape of a molecule. And this depends on the atoms, their sizes, the type of bonds, their orientation in space, the number of bonds they can make with each other, and the type of bonds they make, whether they're single, double, or triple. The different atoms that can make a covalent bond, they have different abilities to attract electrons toward them, and this is called electronegativity. Some atoms have a very high ability to attract atoms towards them, such as oxygen, nitrogen, etc., and these would get the atoms closer, would get the electrons closer to them, but not completely, but they do not completely own them. So depending on that, they're going to get a partial negative charge. The other atom that contributes to the covalent bond but still cannot attract the atom as the first one contributing to the covalent bond is going to have the electron far away from it, and this makes this atom relatively with a partial positive charge, because again it's not going to lose the electron completely. The polarity can be for the bonds in a molecule, and it also can be used to describe the whole molecule. For example, if we take a CO2 molecule, in this molecule there is a carbon connected to two oxygens via double bonds. So there is a polar bond because there is a difference in electronegativity between carbon and oxygen, and same thing for the other double bond. But because there are no unshared pairs of electrons around the carbon, and these two double bonds are exactly the same, so the best way to distribute them around the carbon to make them as far as possible from each other is to just put them linear or with a 180 degrees angle. So this means that they're completely in two opposite directions, because we're talking about one oxygen here, a double bond here, and a double bond here. So depending on this, or according to that, I would expect them to cancel each other and making this whole molecule nonpolar, although it contains polar bonds. Each one of these is a polar bond. Another example here is an H2O molecule or a water molecule, where we have an oxygen connected to two hydrogens via single bonds, but we still have two unshared pairs of electrons for the oxygen. And because electrons are charged with a negative charge, as you know, so I would expect them to repulse each other. So to reduce the amount of repulsion, we would just bend the molecule and get the hydrogens away, and get more space for the electron pairs to occupy. This is going to bend the molecule, as you can see in here, and creates an angle different than the 180 degrees we've seen in the CO2. And depending on this, or if we just look at the molecule, the forces, although the bonds are the same here, and the difference in electronegativity is the same, since we have a bond between oxygen and hydrogen, but because their orientation is not exactly the opposite, they won't cancel each other and they would create a polar molecule. So we have polar bonds and polar molecule. Okay. Whenever we have double bonds around the carbon, these double bonds are shorter in comparison to the these double bonds are relatively stronger than the single bonds, and they are shorter and stronger. If we compare the double bond with a single bond, generally, and it's better to compare it with the same atom. So they're shorter, they're stronger, and they're more rigid in terms of rotation around them. Regarding electronegativity, which is shown in this picture, the difference in electronegativity between carbon and oxygen is 0.89, whereas it is between carbon and hydrogen is 0.32, and it's almost negligible and makes the electrons just lie almost in the middle of the distance between carbon and hydrogen. So I would consider this bond between carbon and hydrogen nonpolar, whereas that between carbon and oxygen as a polar bond. Non-covalent interactions is another thing to review before we get into more details of this course. And the non-covalent interactions are actually a type of connections between molecules in which there are no shared electrons. So it's different than they're different than the covalent bonds. There are no shared electrons. They're just interactions in a kind of attractions and repulsions that can be made between different molecules. It's not even between the atoms of the same molecule, unless it's a very large or a huge molecule. It can form between the atoms of the same molecule. But generally, if we talk about just small molecules, just like H2O molecules and examples like these, they're going to be between one water molecule and another water molecule, one water molecule and, for example, an alcohol molecule, etc. These are reversible, which means they form and detach, and they form and break all the time, and they are relatively weak, and we'll compare them with the covalent bonds. There are different types of non-covalent interactions, and we start with the electrostatic interactions. It's just like ionic bond. These are ionic bonds in which charge and charges interact with each other, and we all know that same charges are going to get attracted to each other, whereas same charges are going to get into repulsion, and different charges are going to get into attraction to each other. These charges can be full charges like +1 to -1, or they can be partial charges attracted to each other. But if we're talking about attraction, they have to be in opposite charges, positive and negative. And they can be full charge to a partial charge also. So all different combinations could be classified as electrostatic interactions. A special case of electrostatic interaction is the hydrogen bond. And the hydrogen bond, as the name implies, includes a hydrogen. So what does this mean? Or how can we form a hydrogen bond as a non-covalent interaction? For example, if we have a molecule in which a hydrogen is covalently bonded to a highly electronegative atom like nitrogen, oxygen, etc., it's going to accept or to become a partially positive side. Okay, so this partial positive charge can get attracted to a partial negative charge in another molecule. Okay, and partial negative charge is due to a highly electronegative atom like nitrogen, oxygen, fluor, sulfur, etc. This interaction or this attraction between the hydrogen of the partial positive charge and the highly electronegative atom with a partial negative charge is called hydrogen bond. This hydrogen here is a hydrogen bond donor, and this nitrogen or oxygen is a hydrogen bond acceptor. So for a hydrogen bond to form, we have to have a donor and an acceptor, and again we have charges attracted to each other. That's why this type of non-covalent interactions can be considered as a special case of electrostatic interactions. The third type is the van der Waals interactions, and in this type of non-covalent interactions, the attraction that happens between different atoms is attributed or is due to the movement of electrons. As you all know, electrons move all the time around the atoms. So they're going to be at one time point in a special location, and they're going to move afterwards to another location in the orbit. So the previous site becomes partially positive, or it becomes relatively positive, and the second side is going to become relatively negative because the electron is present now in this location. This is in one atom for one electron. Let's look at another atom with another electron. The same thing is going to happen. So if these atoms are close to each other, they won't have the two electrons at this position, for example, and this position at the same time, because they get into repulsion. So they have to be as far as possible. So the electron is going to be right here, for example, at this time point, and in this atom is going to be here. So this region is relatively positive, and it gets attracted to the relatively negative region of the adjacent atom. So this type of attraction that lasts for a very short time because electrons are going to move quickly is going to is called the van der Waals interactions. And this is a very weak type of non-covalent interactions, and it's actually the weakest, and it needs a very small amount of energy to break them. The last type of interactions, non-covalent interactions, is the hydrophobic interactions. It's not a real one, but it's the force that drives and associates nonpolar molecules, okay, that are found, for example, in a solution or in an aqueous environment, and associates them together, just like when you spray or splash oil droplets on a surface of water. So they're going to spread in like small droplets on the surface of water, and then in a very small amount of time they're going to gather in a very large droplet together. The forces that drove them to become a large droplet instead of small ones are the hydrophobic interactions. Okay. And this type of interactions is very important during, for example, washing your hands, washing your dishes, washing your laundry, for example. In all these examples, we're going to remove grease, which is hydrophobic, by using soap and water. And you know that water is not going to mix with the grease on your hands, for example. So what happens is the following. This molecule is the soap molecule, and in terms of chemistry, it's made of two parts. One part is hydrophobic, and the other part is polar or hydrophilic. So the overall molecule is amphipathic. One side nonpolar and one side polar. So what you actually try to do is to mix water, these are water molecules, with the soap and the grease. But this mixing is not going to last like what's shown in this slide, because this part of the soap molecule, is hydrophobic. So this is unstable for these molecules. So hydrophobic interactions are going to drive these molecules next to each other to get them as far as possible from water molecules, as you can see in here. But still, we have the sides here and the bottoms here still surrounded by water molecules, and this is still unstable. So how can we separate these soap molecules from the surrounding water? By making a sphere or a ball of soap molecules. So this is a sphere. It's not like a ring, but they cut a section through it to show you the inside of it. This ball structure is called the micelle, in which the hydrophobic or the nonpolar side is going to get into the inside of the bowl, and it's going to take the grease and the fat molecules and the dirt on your hands into the inside because it's hydrophobic, whereas the polar sides, that is the blue balls, is going to get on the outside of the bowl. Okay, so the outside of the ball is polar and surrounded by water molecules which are polar, and this is very stable, whereas the nonpolar sides of the soap molecules, together with the grease on your hands or on the dish or on your clothes, whatever, is inside the micelle. Okay, like in a cage-like structure. So what drove them to do this is the hydrophobic interactions again. The general properties of non-covalent interactions, that as I said before, they're reversible, so they form and break all the time, so they have a very short half-life. They're relatively weak, so if we compare, for example, the energy we need to break carbon-carbon single bond, it's around 350 kilojoule per mole, whereas we need 1 to 30 kilojoule per mole to break a non-covalent interaction, and it's like more than 10 times less for a non-covalent interaction in terms of energy that we need to break it. And the strongest of the non-covalent interactions, I mean if we compare non-covalent to non-covalent, is the hydrogen bond as well as the ionic interactions. So these are the strongest, whereas the van der Waals is the weakest. Other properties include the specific interactions. What does a specific interaction means? So we have to have special conditions for one type of non-covalent interaction to happen. As we've seen in hydrogen bond, it has certain conditions to happen. For example, ionic interactions, we have to have negative charges, same charges, repulsion, different charges, attraction, etc. Another condition that needs also to be met for these interactions to happen is the distance. Molecules have to be very close to each other for non-covalent interactions to happen, and they have to be in a proper orientation, because if they are in opposite orientations or in an improper orientation, they would be a little bit far from each other and no interaction would happen between them. Just in simple words, or in a very simple example, if you and your friend are sitting in very distant locations in the lecture hall, the chance of interaction between you and gossiping between you is going to be very low. Whereas if you just sit next to each other, there's much more chance to talk to each other. In terms of orientation, if one of you is sitting, if both of you are facing each other, there's much more chance to talk and interact, rather than if you're just sitting in different orientations, one of you is giving his back to the other. So this is just an analogy to make things clear to you. They can be also attractive or repulsive. They are weak, as I said before, but the presence of large number of these interactions, and this is what actually present between molecules, is going to contribute to the structural stability and the functionality, as well as the shape of the molecule in the 3D space. Now we're going to talk about carbon atom, because it's the main atom in organic molecules, as you've taken in the organic chemistry course, and remind you with some properties of this atom. This atom, as you all know, has 6 electrons around its nucleus, with 4 ones in the last orbit, and this means that it needs to make 4 bonds with different types of atoms, whether they're carbons or other types of atoms. The bonds can be can be single bonds, double bonds, triple bonds, etc. They have different strengths, they have different lengths, they have different ability to rotate around these bonds, and their contribution to the shape of the molecule is going to be different. These carbons can be arranged in organic molecules in a linear way, or they can get arranged in a ring structure, as you're going to see in different types of molecules that we're going to discuss, inshallah, later on during this semester. Other properties of a carbon, that they have angles, or they make angles in between the atoms that make up the structure of different molecules, and these angles depend on the type of bonds, whether they're single, double, or triple. They also depend on the presence of unshared pairs of electrons, or unpresence of these electrons, and this would give an overall shape of the molecule that makes it different and affects its properties, and makes isomers even of the molecules that have the same formula. Another property is the formation of both polar and non-polar bonds, and as well as polar and non-polar molecules, because carbon can form different types of bonds, and if it forms a bond with another carbon, for example, or with hydrogen, for example, there is no difference in electronegativity, and they're going to be they're going to form non-polar bonds. Whereas if it forms a covalent bond with a highly electronegative atom, it's going to accept a partial positive charge, and the other one accepts or becomes partially negative, and this creates a polar covalent bond that may contribute to the polarity of the whole molecule. What makes the different compounds of organic chemistry diverse, and what makes them have different types of functions and properties, reactions, etc., is the presence of different functional groups that you've discussed in a very detailed way in the organic chemistry course. And they can be just single bonds of and molecules that are made of carbon and hydrogen, or hydrocarbons such as alkenes. We may have double bonds or triple bonds like alkenes and alkynes. We may have other functional groups like we've seen you've seen in alcohols like OH, thiols, SH, the ether, ROR, general structure, the amines where we have nitrogens, as well as the amides, aldehydes and ketones, where we have a carbonyl carbon, as well as the carboxylic acids. Same thing for esters and amides with different additions like the OR for ester and NH2 for amide, phosphoric acid derivatives, in which phosphatic groups of different numbers can be added to different molecules, and this is a very important reaction during metabolism of molecules in our cells. The next molecule we're going to discuss or talk about today is the water molecule. And why would we give it such importance? You all know that it constitutes more than or around 60% of our body weight. And if we just look at the weight of the cells themselves, excluding other spaces in our bodies, it even constitutes more than 60%. It's like 70 to 85% of the weight of cells or of a typical cell is made of water. So what's next? This water is going to act as a solvent, whether it's inside cells or outside cells, for many substances. And the importance of this, when we have molecules solved in water, it's going to be easier to transport these molecules from one side to another inside your body. This is one thing. Another thing, it's going to facilitate reactions and acts as medium for reactions to happen. And if you remember, for reactions to happen, collisions have to occur between the reacting molecules. And if they are in an aqueous solution, they're going to move easier, collide with each other, and there's much more chance for them to interact. Whereas if they're sitting in a solid substance, they won't move, they won't collide, they won't have proper orientation for collisions to happen. So this would interfere with the reactions to happen. They also water molecules contribute to the homeostasis, and what homeostasis means is the stability of the internal environment of your body, specifically for the acids and bases. And we're going to discuss this later on and give you examples how our body can takes advantage and with the help of water molecules can keep the pH or the acidity of the different solutions in our bodies. Water molecules also contribute to regulation of temperature in your body, and keeping it within a certain range, so you don't get your temperature raised a lot or decreased a lot when you go to a high when you go outside in a hot weather, or when you go outside in a cold weather, for example. And this is due to the high specific heat of water. Also, water molecules can be contributing to the reactions themselves, not just by acting as a medium for reactions to happen, but by also interacting with the reactants and contributing to the reaction itself as a participant in the reaction. So because of all these reasons, water is a very important molecule in our cells and our body. It is distributed for average person of 70 kilograms, and it's present as 40 liters, distributed as 25 liters intracellularly inside the cells, and 15 liters extracellularly in the extracellular fluid. And these 15 liters of the extracellular fluid are distributed between the interstitial space between the cells. It takes like 10 liters, and 5 liters for blood, and some amount for lymph. The properties of water include several ones, and we'll start with the polarity of these molecules that we've already touched upon previously. As we said earlier, water molecule has two unshared pairs of electrons that are going to bend the molecule and makes an angle and make an angle between the hydrogens and oxygen, resulting in a formation of a polar molecule, because the forces are not completely in complete or opposite directions. So water molecule is a polar molecule. It also contains highly electronegative atom of oxygen, so this makes the bonds themselves as polar bonds and the molecule as a whole as a polar molecule. Also, water molecules are highly cohesive, and they can produce a network of molecules by interacting with each other through hydrogen bonds. As I said before, that needs a hydrogen bond donor, which is the hydrogen, and a hydrogen bond acceptor, which is the oxygen, in another molecule of water. Other properties of water include their action or their ability to dissolve different substances and different solutes. And the dissolution itself is actually a process of hydrogen bond formation between water molecules and the solute, water molecules and a different type of solute. So the hydrogen here is the donor, the hydrogen here is the donor, and this oxygen is the acceptor, for example, and this nitrogen is the acceptor in this other molecule. Another way of dissolution, if we're talking about dissolving an ionic compound like NaCl, we start with a crystal of NaCl in a solid state, organized with a Cl- in these represented by these big balls, and the Na plus represented by the small balls. So water molecules start to intermingle or interweave in between the Na plus and Cl- of the crystal, and they would end up by forming hydration shells around Na plus and Cl- that have different sizes and different shape. Around the Na plus, oxygen is going to be close to the Na plus because it has a partial negative charge, so they would get attracted to each other. Whereas the Cl- has a negative charge, so the hydrogen would be closer to the Cl- as it has a partial positive charge. What happens to the hydrogen bonds between water molecules, and how is it affected by the state of the of water, whether it's solid or aqueous or gas? This is a crystal of water molecule, and we've just focused on this molecule and look how many molecules it interacted with. So this is one on the right, one on the left, one down here, and one to the inside. So there are 4 molecules of water surrounding this water molecule in a crystal of ice. If we increase the temperature of this ice to 10 degrees, the number of hydrogen bonds decreases to 3.4. So what do we mean by a 3.4 hydrogen bond? There is no 0.4 hydrogen bond. There is a half-life of hydrogen bond that is around nanoseconds. So they form and break all the time in a nanosecond unit of time. So the average number is 3.4 around each molecule in the liquid state. As we increase the temperature more and more, the molecules are going to accept energy, and they're going to move faster and get away from each other, so the distance increases in between them and makes the formation of hydrogen bond harder. That's why the number of hydrogen bonds decreases if the temperature increases. Other properties of water, that it acts as a nucleophile. We mentioned earlier that it may contribute as a participant in biochemical reactions, and it acts as a nucleophile in some reactions. What a nucleophile means: nucleo is derived from nucleus, and phile means likes. So this molecule is an electron-rich molecule that likes or get attracted to a positive charge. So it's a nucleophile. It likes a positive charge because it has a negative charge. It's rich in electrons. And because water molecule has two unshared pairs of electrons, so it's rich in negative charge, it's rich in electrons, so it gets attracted to positive charge and acts as a nucleophile, for example, in this reaction, and it's going to attack an electrophile, an atom, or an atom that has a positive charge. So it likes electrons because it has a positive charge. Other properties of water, that it can get ionized, and this ionization produces a hydroxyl ion as well as a hydronium ion or proton H+. So if we just ionized one H2O molecule, it produces a proton H+ and OH-. If we ionize two molecules like in here, it produces hydronium ion or H3O+ and OH- or hydroxyl ions. And this is important when we're going to talk about acids and bases later on, inshallah. The last thing that we're going to talk or to discuss about water is their ability or their role in thermal regulation, as I said earlier. So as I said, water has a high specific heat, and what specific heat means is the amount of energy we need to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water molecules or whatever type of molecule by 1 degree of Celsius scale. So if this specific heat is high, this means that I need a very large amount of energy and a very high heat to increase the amount of the temperature of water just by 1 degree. For example, if you go outside and the temperature is really high, it's around like 50, you're not going to get your body with that temperature, because much of this temperature is going to get dissipated to raise the temperature of the body or the water in the body by a very small amount of increase. So it resists the changes in temperature of the whole body. Another thing is that the heat of vaporization of water is also high in or relative to the heat of vaporization of molecules similar to the structure of the H2O or the water molecule. So when, for example, if you are under high temperature and you're sweating, so there's liquid leaking out of your body because of the sweating process. So this liquid, or this water, as a major constituent of sweat, is going to evaporate, and it's going to get or to accept a very or absorb a very large amount of heat on your skin to evaporate. So if it takes or absorbs this heat from your skin, you're going to feel the cooling effect. You're going to feel that the temperature is low on your skin, and this is what happens. The sweating is going to get you in a cooling effect that decreases your sensation of the high temperature outside if you go in a high temperature in a hot day. So once the temperature of the sweating increases, evaporization increases, and this means that the molecules of water on your skin are getting energy. They move faster, they break hydrogen bonds and reduce their number, resulting in evaporization and the cooling effect that you can feel. So I hope this was clear about the water molecule and its properties, as well as the carbon atom and the introduction about the science of biochemistry. And we'll see you, or we'll inshallah discuss with you another topic in the next video, inshallah.